Hi, welcome back to the channel. This video is about the Party Wall Act in respect of extensions. We already have video on our channel talking about the Party Wall Act in respect of loft conversions, and we've been asked if we could post a similar one for extensions, and this is it. So in today's video, we're going to talk about what the Party Wall Act is, why it was put in place, how it relates to you with regards to your extension project, what you need to do, and why it's important that you go through everything thoroughly and do things by the book. So the Party Wall Act was introduced in 1996, so it's been around for a very long time. And it was introduced to help homeowners to be able to do the jobs that they wanted to do. So whilst a lot of people consider the Party Wall Act to be a hassle and something that's causing them time delays and more paperwork and more cost, it's actually there to facilitate your job, because what it says in the Act is that a party wall is owned jointly by two neighbours, and you have the right to build on that party wall, whether it be a loft conversion or an extension. It's your right to be able to use that party wall, but you just have to make sure that you've done certain things in order to do it properly. So it's basically there to help you facilitate your project. So it's a positive thing. So a lot of people feel very negative about the Party Wall Act and all of the paperwork around it. It isn't something you should feel negative about. It's actually there to help you get the job done. So that's the first point. It's something positive that makes sure that you can definitely build your extension, whether your neighbour likes it or not. In terms of how the Party Wall Act relates to extensions, well, it's predominantly to do with boundaries and foundations. So when we talked in the loft conversion video, it was predominantly to do with the wall that is built between your house and your neighbour's house if you've got an adjoining house. In this situation, it's really focusing on how close your neighbour's house is to your house and how deep their foundations are. So if you've got a semi-detached or a terraced house, so you've got a house that is actually adjoined to your neighbour, you will definitely have to do a party wall agreement, no doubt about it, because your foundations are very close to their foundations. If you've got a detached house, it depends on how close your neighbour's property is to your property. So we'll have a look at the details in a minute, but generally speaking, if your neighbour's house is within 6 metres of your house, you're going to have to do a Party Wall Act. So even if you've got a detached house, if your neighbour's house is relatively close to your building, then you will have to do a party wall agreement, even though instinctively you'd be thinking, well, there's no party wall, we don't have a shared wall. It's not about shared walls for extensions, it's about foundations and the potential damage that you digging the ground deeper than their foundations can cause to their property. So that's really the key issue here. It's all about potential damage to their property rather than any work on a joint wall or anything of that nature. It's always helpful to get as much knowledge and understanding as possible about what the Party Wall Act is when you're dealing with it. There's a really helpful government booklet online that you can access. So if you type in Party Wall Act 1996 into Google, you'll find the gov.uk link that takes you to the Act. So let's have a look at that now. So this is the Act itself. So it's a relatively easy to understand document. So it's written in a form that is easy for homeowners to use. It's not something super complicated written only for surveyors and builders. It's available to all of us. So if we scroll through, you can read all of this at your leisure. There's a lot of information in here that's useful to know, but it tells you what the party wall is. And the key thing we're really looking to do is find the bit that relates to extensions. So if we go through to the section that says new building on the boundary line between neighbouring pieces of land. So this is really looking at when you want to build a new wall that's close to the boundary between your property and your neighbour's property. That's the first issue. And the second one is excavating near neighbouring buildings. So this is what we just talked about, that if you're wanting to dig some foundations to build a new structure that is close to your neighbour's buildings, then there are some rules relating to that. So you can see here, it says, if you want to excavate within 3 meters of any part of a neighbouring owner's building or structure, or within 6 meters of a part of a neighbouring building or structure where any part of that work will meet a line drawn downwards at 45 degrees in the direction of the excavation. Now that sounds quite complicated, but thankfully there are some diagrams that help us understand that. So the first one here, if you want to dig foundations for a new structure on your property, then it's a very easy to measure 3 meter distance between your wall and your neighbour's wall. If it's less than 3 meters, then you will have to do a party wall agreement and get them on board for that. So that's pretty simple. That's really easy to measure. You just get your tape measure out. If it's less than 3 meters, you'll have to do it. If it's more than 3 meters, you might not have to do it, but we'll have a look at the next part in a second. If you're adjoined, you definitely will have to do it. This is really where you're not adjoined. And if you are a semi-detached property, and maybe you're adjoined on one side, and then on the other side there is a gap to the next property, then it might be that you have to do a party wall agreement with both neighbours. So the adjoining neighbour, you will definitely have to do one with. The people who are separated from you, you need to measure whether they are more than 3 meters away. So that's the first test. Then the second test, if we scroll down to this second diagram, this one is a little bit more difficult to calculate, but you can see here what they've done. They've drawn a line at 45 degrees from the bottom of your neighbour's foundations. So you'll have to visualise where your neighbour's foundations are. The current regulations say that foundations should be 1 metre deep. So if they're 1 metre deep, you would draw this 45 line at 1 metre underground, and then you'd need to see whether or not your new foundations cross that boundary to affect your neighbour's property. So the whole concept here is that you disturbing the ground, you digging down, creating a foundation, could cause the ground to have some movement or some weakness, which could potentially impact on your neighbour's foundations and therefore cause their walls to crack and have some issues going forward. So that's really what we're trying to protect against, is your digging causing your neighbour's property to become unstable. So here you'd need to make a judgment view, how close the neighbour's property is, and then whether or not this 45-degree line is going to impact of less than 6 meters. So it's a little bit more difficult to calculate. The easiest thing to do is, if in doubt, do the party wall agreement. So if you're not sure, if you think it's marginal, if you think it's possible that you're within 6 meters of your neighbour's foundation on a 45-degree line, just go ahead and do the party wall. It's easier, and make sure you don't have the problems we talked about earlier of upsetting the neighbour, falling out, and them trying to stop you doing your build once you've started it. So there, the calculations, that's basically the easiest way to work out whether you need to put a party wall agreement in place. The other issue that you may have, and it's detailed in the booklet, but we won't go into it in any detail, is where you want to build on the boundary line. So where you've got a boundary between your two properties, if you want to construct a wall on that boundary, you will need your neighbour's consent for that, because you both own the boundary. If you're building your wall inside the boundary, so on your side of the boundary line, that's fine. But if you want to construct it down the middle, and sometimes people do that because if your neighbour wants to build an extension on their side, then having a joint wall on the boundary can be helpful to both of you. It can help save costs because you can both use that wall. If you build on your side only, then your neighbour will have to build on his side, and therefore you'll have two walls up against each other, which is tricky to finish if you're building the second wall, because the first wall will restrict your access to the brickwork on that wall. So they're the reasons that you need to put a party wall agreement in place. So what do you have to do before you can start your work? That's the key question. Well, what you have to do is you need to issue your neighbours with notice. So if you've got two neighbours, so let's take an example where you're a mid-terrace and you're joined on both sides, then you'll definitely have to do a party wall agreement with the neighbour on both sides. So that's two different party wall agreements. If you've got a semi-detached house, you may be able to get away with just doing it with one neighbour. However, as we just discussed, you need to know how close the other neighbour is and whether or not the 3 metre or 6 metre rule will impact you, and whether you'd need to put that in place for that neighbour as well. So you still may need to do both neighbours. If you live in a detached house, it depends how close you are to the other houses, but you may need to do it with one or both neighbours anyway. The best thing to do with all of this is to give them a heads up. So if you know your neighbour, if you're familiar with them, go around and tell them what it is you're wanting to do. So say, just pop around and say, look, we're thinking about doing an extension. We want to build it within the next few months, and we're going to have a look into the Party Wall Act, and we'll come around and notify you when we're ready. That's the best way of doing it. Just giving them the heads up, because they then are in the know. They understand what it is you want to do. They may already have done one, so they might already know about the process, but they're in the picture. You've kept them up to speed. So that's always helpful, because then they're likely to be more helpful to you going forward. Once you've notified them, you actually need to formally notify them in writing. So you can do this yourself. So have a look at the Party Wall Act booklet that we just looked at. It's got some examples in there of the letter that you need to give to your neighbour. So you can use that template. You can fill in your details and their details, and that's basically the starting point for your party wall discussion. You basically give them a letter that says, I would like to build this structure in my garden at the right time, and it asks them to consent. So basically, you give them the notice, and they have the option of doing three things. They can say, firstly, I agree to this. So they may sign your letter, and that's the end of that. If they agree to it, that's the end of it. You don't need to involve any surveyors or any more costs or any more fees. It's literally, you've told them what you want to do. They've said, that's fine. They agree to it. Job done. That is the easiest option. That is your perfect outcome. So that's why it's really important to pop around and have a cup of tea with the neighbour and tell them what you want to do, because you're doing it in a friendly fashion. You're more likely to get a positive outcome if you do it that way round. If you do it as a sort of relaxed, easy chat, then it's more likely you'll get them to agree. And that's really what your goal should be. If they don't agree, then they can basically say, well, I'm happy for you to build it, but I would like to be protected, so I would like a Party Wall Act to be put in place. Now, that's not uncommon. It's fairly standard for neighbours to ask for that, because even though they know you and they like you and you may have a good relationship, they may just still want to be covered in the event that something goes wrong and they put the Party Wall Act in place. So they may say to you, yes, I'm happy for you to do the work, but I'd still like a Party Wall Act agreement put in place. So don't get upset, don't fall out over that. That's quite normal. That's just them having a document that protects them in the event of some future problem. So it might be that they say that. If they do say that, then there's a few different options. So the first one is that they can agree to use your proposed surveyor. So when you put a letter together, the initial letter, you will propose a surveyor. So you can say, oh, in the event that we need to have a Party Wall Act, I propose to use XYZ Limited as my surveyor. The easiest outcome for you is for your neighbour to also agree to use that surveyor, because that means you've only got one person employed. They can do the job for both parties, come out. They're not charging you double time. It's much simpler, easier, and lower cost for you. That's your best outcome on the basis of a party wall agreement. The other option is where your neighbour basically says, I don't agree, I want a party wall agreement, and I'm not happy to use your surveyor, I want to use my own surveyor. In that circumstance, you've got a couple of options. You can either say, that's fine, I'll have my surveyor, XYZ Limited, and you have your surveyor, ABC Limited, and we'll work on that basis. So we're having to pay two different firms of surveyors. That's not ideal for you because it's doubling your cost. And also, in the event that there's a disagreement between those two sets of surveyors, you will then have to employ a third surveyor to adjudicate between any decisions. So that's really not the road you want to go down, because that potentially could cause you 3 times the cost because you're having to pay for 3 different sets of surveyors. If your neighbour says, I don't agree and I want to use my own surveyor, your next best option really is to say that, okay, I will use your surveyor also. So that surveyor that your neighbour is proposing, you use them as well. and then it minimises the amount of cost, because when that surveyor comes out to site, they're only charging you for one site visit and one set of analysis. So that's really your best option. But generally speaking, the best outcome is to try and persuade your neighbour to sign the letter, or if not, to use the same surveyor. So try and do it on a friendly basis. If you're dealing with two sets of neighbours simultaneously, obviously, if they both want to use surveyors, it's better if you can get the same surveyor to act for everybody, rather than having lots of different surveyors appointed all to do the same job, because it's just going to cost you more money. And the bottom line on all of this, unfortunately, is that you have to pay for all of it. Your neighbour doesn't pay a penny, because it's your project, it's your benefit, therefore you have to cover the cost of this. And we've had some situations recently where we did have two sets of neighbours who both objected. They proposed a surveyor that they wanted to use, who unfortunately was very expensive. We used them as well to try and minimise the cost, but it ended up costing over £5,000 for all of that work. And the guy did do very little. He came out, took some photographs, and that was it. And it was a very expensive set of very boring photographs that we had to pay for. Unfortunately, sometimes that's just the way it goes. We've had lots of other situations where we have had the neighbours sign the consent letter and we didn't have any cost. So it swings and roundabouts and really depends on what your neighbours are like and whether or not you can persuade them to sign that letter. In terms of timing, you have to give your neighbour 1 month's notice before you can start work. So when you issue them with the formal letter that's in the booklet, or you can appoint a Party Wall Surveyor if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself. There's plenty online. We'd recommend going online, doing a search for I need a Party Wall Surveyor. Lots of different people will come up. Pick one, take some quotes, so get 3 or 4 quotes, and then pick the cheapest one would be our advice, because they're much of a muchness. It's not particularly scientific, and if you can get one for a low cost, then that's your best option. So you will need to give your neighbour 1 month's notice before you can start the work. So you need to factor that in to the timing for your project. Your neighbour can agree to reduce that to whatever time you want. So if your neighbour signs the consent letter, they may say you can start tomorrow if you like, but don't bank on that. You must factor in at least 1 month into your planning, because if your neighbour objects, it'll take at least a month. It could take more, because surveyors are busy. They have to come out and do an initial inspection. So it could take you 2 or 3 months. Or if you go into a rabbit hole of objections and problems and issues, then it could take a lot longer. So factor in some time, give yourself some headroom, and basically make sure you've got enough time to get through the process. Once you've issued the notice and you've got the signed agreement, basically what you need to do is keep your surveyor up to date as what's happening and notify them when the job is finished. He will issue both sets of neighbours and you with a Party Wall Act once he's taken all the photographs and put everything in place that basically says, yes, everything's been done and dusted. This was the state of all the properties before the work started. Hopefully you won't have any future problems, but there's a potential that if cracks appear or other issues appear in your neighbour's house, then they could complain and they will go to the surveyor, and your surveyor will have to come out, check their property, and then makes a decision as to whether that was caused by your work. If it was, you will have to repair that work, and either you can have your guys do it yourself, or you'll have to get your neighbour to do it and you give them the money. So there is a potential for additional costs going forward, but generally speaking, that's relatively uncommon. So hopefully you'll be okay as long as your builders do everything correctly. So hopefully this has given you a good introduction to the Party Wall Act. The government booklet that we referred to earlier is a really useful guide. That's something really easy to understand and will help you as a good point of reference as you go through the process. So please keep that to hand and go through everything in there and make sure you're doing everything correctly. If you found this useful and helpful, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.